On today's show, let's learn more about new Cavs head coach Kenny Atkinson from someone who covered the team he used to coach the Brooklyn Nets. Adam Armbrecht joins Locked On Cavs today.
You are Locked On Cavs, your daily Cleveland Cavaliers podcast.
Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thank you for making Locked On Cavs your first listen every day. You can find the show wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, everywhere else. Be sure to give us a 5-star review. Leave a comment as well. You can also find the show on our YouTube channel. Just search Locked On Cavs on YouTube. Like this video if you're watching on YouTube. Make sure you are subscribed to the Locked On Cavs YouTube channel. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more as the playoffs wind down. They're now over in both basketball and hockey. The sports aren't going quite as much as we want to, but FanDuel has something for you every day this summer because they are hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Danny Cunningham. You might know me from my time covering the Cleveland Cavaliers at places like Cleveland Magazine, 92.3 The Fan, or some other ones along the way. Joined today by host of Locked On Nets, Adam Armbrecht. Adam has covered the Nets for quite a while, covered part of the Kenny Atkinson era that I've been talking so much about in Brooklyn, as the Cavs have now hired Kenny to be their next head coach, replacing JB Bickerstaff. Adam, thanks so much for taking the time, joining the show today. Very much appreciated. Can't wait to learn a little bit more about Kenny Atkinson.
Oh, of course, man. Listen, anytime that we can look back at what it might be considered the golden era in recent memory for Brooklyn Nets basketball, happy to lend some insight around Kenny Atkinson, someone I'm very happy that he's getting another chance here at the helm for Cleveland.
That does seem like it's a pretty common theme, the happiness to see Kenny get another opportunity as a head coach. And we can talk a little bit about the way that it ended for him in Brooklyn in segment number 2 today. But he does seem, Adam, like someone that, from what I've gathered, is pretty well regarded across the NBA. It seems like a lot of people in Brooklyn hold him in very high regard. Certainly a lot of people out in Golden State, where he's been an assistant, hold him in very high regard. What were your experiences like covering Kenny?
Yeah, I think he was always, good with the media, somewhat transparent by any head coach level in terms of offering some insights around things that were working, player development, what they wanted to do next with the team. And you mentioned it there, coached underneath Budenholzer in Atlanta, goes out with Steve Kerr in the Golden State Warriors. Good learning curve to be able to come up. And I think ultimately, as we'll talk about, the way that the Brooklyn Nets went through their transformation and the transition that they went through is, I think, as much what impacted Kenny Atkinson's trajectory as a head coach as anything else. So I believe Cleveland's really got someone that can help carry them forward here with Donovan Mitchell in mind.
So when Kenny took over the Brooklyn Nets, that franchise, I think it's fair to say, was in a pretty tough spot. They were paying the price for trading for Paul Pierce and Kevin Garnett. That price actually just, won a NBA championship with the Boston Celtics in Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. And it was a dark time in Brooklyn. And Kenny, I think, at least as an observer from afar, was somebody who was able to help lift that franchise out of some really dark days and ultimately into a pretty good era of Nets basketball. What were those early days like? What was he able to do with rosters in Brooklyn that really weren't filled with that much talent?
Yeah, that's an era of reclamation for the organization and for a lot of players, right? You mentioned guys that weren't necessarily considered stars or a different cast of characters season over season. You get a guy like D'Angelo Russell in. You get a guy who never saw a really solid look in Detroit like Spencer Dinwiddie. You think about drafting and having some talent like a Jared Allen, like a Karis LeVert, two players that obviously Cleveland fans are familiar with now. Bringing in holdovers like Damari Carroll from the Atlanta days, right? Kenny Atkinson did a great job of basically being handed a set of ingredients, being told, this is not going to go great because that's not part of what we're trying to accomplish right now in terms of, winning basketball games. And let's see what you can do. And I think player development and maximizing the value of skill sets on the roster is something that you saw year over year. Kenny do an excellent job with Brooklyn.
I think the player development thing is a really big thing for the Cavs. And it's interesting to say that because I don't think player development ever truly stops in the NBA. Like even if you win a title, you're still developing players, you're still trying to get better every year. That's not something that is only limited to teams that are in rebuilding phases. And the Cavs obviously are not in that phase right now. They're coming off of a season where they had home court advantage in the playoffs. They won a playoff series. The year before they had 51 games. But in particular with Evan Mobley, I think one of the biggest things for Kenny, and really something that I might think actually is the barometer for him, Adam, as far as whether or not his tenure in Cleveland is successful, is how much more he's able to get out of Evan Mobley compared to what the last couple of years have been. Because Evan's been a really good basketball player, but I don't think everyone is super satisfied with what his offensive game looks like right now compared to what the potential was coming out of the draft when he was picked third overall a few years back. So I do wonder how much of that player development can be imprinted on a team that also has aspirations of winning, something that maybe Brooklyn didn't quite have.
Yeah, and I think that's the part of the Golden State Warrior era for Kenny Atkinson as a head coach. I think that matters a lot here because you go into winning pedigree and you're not the head coach. Obviously, you're handling a lot of the offensive responsibilities, but you're trying to not only just turn around and say, well, statistically, we got the most out of player X, Y, or Z or improve the percentages, but it also contributed to winning basketball. And I think you're right. You look at a guy like Mobley. Listen, you can look at the first 3 years and say there's incremental successes in certain areas, but when you get taken at a certain level in the draft, and when you're in a mode where you have Donovan Mitchell and you want to be winning in the playoffs, it does come down to looking at a young player like that, a core member of the team, and saying, how do we maximize him? So I like the idea of not only, Jared Allen familiarity in terms of starting lineup players, but I would expect or anticipate that Mobley will be given a slightly different set of directives under Kenny Atkinson than maybe what ends up being, and I don't know if a lot of coaches fall prey to this, resting on what they are coming into the league, right? Okay, you do these 3 things pretty well. That's what we're going to have you do repeatedly, and then we'll try to go ahead and find success in other areas. But as Cavs fans are familiar, go back to the playoffs, great. That kind of resulted in looking at Donovan Mitchell and saying, can you go ahead and win us 4 basketball games in a given
Right.
series? That means we can move on. And I don't think you can have guys that you identify as core members of your team and say, but there aren't raised expectations year over year. I don't know if Mobley has been given that yet in his young career. It's probably a good time to say, let's dial up where our expectations are for you.
Yeah, and I do wonder what those expectations are in the current situation in terms of, the Cavs playing a too big lineup. And I wonder how they change if Jarrett Allen is traded this summer.
Sure.
Certainly an interesting name to bring up. As you mentioned, he is one of 2 guys that has a lot of familiarity on this roster with Kenny Atkinson, the other being Karis LeVert. The one guy that I often look at, too, when I think about Kenny Atkinson and those early Nets teams is D'Angelo Russell, because Russell played at an all-star level in the year before Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving arrived. D'Lo was awesome. He deserved to be on that all-star team. I don't remember if he was an injury replacement or if he made the team from the get-go, but he was a legit really good player in a way that I don't think he's been able to quite recapture since. Certainly not in Golden State. I think his tenure in Minnesota was very up and down, and the same can really be said about his time with the Lakers. What about Kenny's offensive system do you think allowed D'Lo to thrive? And I ask this because I think if Darius Garland is still in Cleveland when the season begins, that he could sort of be a great reclamation project that Kenny could help to elevate back to what he was in terms of an all-star.
Yeah, some of it with D'Angelo Russell, I think was, and this can apply to Darius Garland as well, and I don't mean this inherently as a negative, but bit of an attitude shift, a bit of a perspective shift about what you are and how you can be successful within an offensive system. Now, again, the Nets did not have the player above D'Angelo Russell at that time. They didn't have a Donovan Mitchell, but I think executing patience offensively, trusting that there's value in incorporating some of your wing shooters. Now, remember, Joe Harris is on the Nets roster at the time too. He's cementing himself as one of the top 3-point shooters. So there was, I think, an inherent trust and value for D'Angelo Russell from 2 angles. One, that if you want to maximize what you are as an offensive player, it involves including everyone else. And 2, something that may not apply to Darius Garland, who could be looking for an exit, as I know it's been rumored, depending on what they choose to do with Donovan Mitchell. is there was an incentive for D'Angelo Russell because there was money on the line. If you want to go and get another payday, you needed to reclaim what the opinion was of you as a player. It was at an all-time low, and Brooklyn allowed him to showcase that he could be this all-around player, and he did go on to get a big contract. Darius Garland already has the money. So now I think there's a little bit of this from a Kenny Atkinson perspective of coming in and saying, Darius, you can be a better version of yourself and continue to project yourself forward for another massive contract if you maybe live within the system and sometimes have to accept that your role is not going to be that of an elite number one when you have a Donovan Mitchell. It's just a reality. And those two players have to find a way to coexist. And guess what? It's not going to go the other way. Not that Mitchell won't have expectations, but we're not coming in the door and saying, how does Donovan Mitchell adjust his game to complement Darius Garland? It's the other way around, and Garland needs to accept that.
Right. And I do think that's a very important thing to note because, the Cavs have a star player, and the Nets at that point were a team that was searching for one. And D'Angelo Russell filled in as that pseudo star for that season, certainly. And I think that's a very good point to make. I do want to ask about the culture. I do want to ask about Kenny Atkinson's exit in Brooklyn because I think those two things are very tightly related to each other. So I will do that next right here on Locked On Cavs. Today's show is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, LED headlights, exhaust kits, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you will always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. So let's fast forward a little bit. We've talked about, the D'Angelo Russell era, the Jarrett Allen, Karis LeVert era, the fun Nets teams, as you termed it before we started recording today. What kind of is the golden era of modern Nets basketball? That magical season where they made the playoffs with D'Angelo Russell at the helm.
They promptly got bounced out of the playoffs. You know what I mean? The golden era, again, in recent memory, is the Nets scrapping to the playoffs. But that's the last one we got.
But there is something about that, and it's because it feels so organic. I was watching a ton of those games, and a lot of Cavs fans were watching a ton of games when Kenny Atkinson was coaching, not necessarily the year they made the playoffs, but the year before when the Cavs had Brooklyn's pick. That was part of the Kyrie Irving trade because these teams are just so connected to each other, it seems like. So I do think Cavs fans actually have a relatively decent understanding of Kenny Atkinson because of that. But the one thing that Atkinson, I thought, did really, really well, and you spoke about it a little bit in the first segment, was build that culture. And that is something that helped to get the best out of D'Angelo Russell, helped to develop someone like Jarrett Allen, helped to turn the Nets from a team that looked like it had no bright future, no picks, was stuck in a rebuild without the draft assets that you typically need, into a team that made the playoffs. And that is something that I do think that now the Cavs don't have a weak culture or anything like that, but I do think Kenny can bring in a really good culture to Cleveland. I think that's something that was pretty prevalent in Brooklyn.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about, for Brooklyn, you're trying to, again, this organization has a history of it, go all in on making trades or acquisitions of superstars, maybe have that not be so successful, and then try to rebound from that and rebuild from it. But I do think that Kenny Atkinson, obviously, Sean Marks brought him in. Sean Marks is the Teflon GM here as well, who can continue to survive different eras and iterations. It confounds us at times. There's things that he does really well, and in some ways it correlates to Kenny Atkinson. Hey, I identify talent that maybe is being underutilized elsewhere, and then I bring it in. And then I have a coach that maximizes the underutilized, undervalued talent that other teams were not looking at in the same way. So Kenny comes in and ushers in that era of hard-nosed, hard work. I mean, listen, this is Brooklyn grit. Like, that's a part of that cultural identity that came up with those teams too as well. And if you think about it transitioning to Cleveland, I would say, again, having the star in place, but it would be that the mentality, because I don't think Cleveland has that culture issue, as you mentioned, but instilling it in all of the other players, first and foremost, the guys that are going to be the end of the bench dudes that need to come in for 12 minutes, give you some really good reps, maybe knock down a couple of shots, maybe play some gritty defense. That part of it, I think, was the foundation that Kenny was laying with Brooklyn. Remember, there was a 30 games under 500 season in there as well. So it's not like it was all sunshine and rainbows, but over those couple of seasons, you said, hey, this is the foundation. This is what we identify as. And if you have hungry players that has something to prove, that does help to move the margins. And then you maybe get lucky in clicking into a couple of these key guys, a D'Angelo Russell, a Spencer Dinwiddie, a Joe Harris, getting a Jared Allen, seeing his development come along as well. And then some other veterans from around the league that just fill in those gaps a little bit for you too. So culture matters when you are either a bad team or, in Cleveland's case, a team that is trying to go from, gosh, we're good. Why can't we get over this hump? Why can't we be talked about as one of the best teams in the Eastern Conference? We seem to, at times, come up a little bit short in playoff basketball. I think Kenny Atkinson can maybe be the needle mover there for the Cavs.
Yeah, and I absolutely think that it's a much tougher jump to go from good to great than it is from bad to good. Right? Like both of us have seen the teams we've covered go from bad to good. You saw it with the Nets. I've seen it here in Cleveland. What we haven't seen, and it's been very different for me being in Cleveland just with the LeBron history, because if there's anyone that can microwave success, it was LeBron when he was 29 years old coming back to Cleveland. Like you just skipped going from bad to good. You just went from bad to great. And that doesn't happen. But that is the one thing I am curious if Kenny can bring that out, because that is where things in some senses went wrong when the Nets now had the pressure of going from good to, hey, we signed Kevin Durant, we signed Kyrie Irving in July of 2019. Now we have to be great. And it didn't work out. What do you think went wrong at the end of the Brooklyn Nets era for Kenny Atkinson?
I don't know if Kenny Atkinson was ever really in a position to be the coach that was going to lead to their ultimate success. I've referenced this before. It's not a knock on Kyrie Irving, but he mentioned early days. Well, some days it'll be me. Some days it'll be Kevin Durant. Some days it'll be Kenny. We'll all be coaching the team,
Oh, I forgot about that quote.
And that's, and listen, having gone through the spectrum of the Kyrie Irving experience and now seeing the way that he's been in Dallas and the way that he talks, I think that he went through a lot of growth for himself, on an individual level. So I think he might reflect back and say, I didn't mean it that way, or I wasn't implying that Kenny didn't matter. But when you have superstars, again, Cleveland knows this. You think that Kenny Atkinson's name wasn't put across in front of Donovan Mitchell to say, hey, if we go this direction, is this a coach you'd like to play for? Do you think that this would work for you? Of course, because his input matters if you want to keep him around. Likewise, once the Brooklyn Nets went the Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving route, it was you sacrifice some level of organizational control. So if they don't like the idea necessarily of being coached, which is there's an irony to it. This is the coach that built up the roster that made it attractive for you to come here. But if you don't have belief in him, and that maybe comes down to Kenny Atkinson is not the Steve Kerr of the NBA. He's not, Greg Popovich, someone that has developed a lot of track record, a lot of high-level NBA championship success. Maybe we just don't fully buy in to sitting down in the huddle and having him say, this is what I want us to do, as opposed to we're going to play our game because we're two of the best players in the game, and then the pieces falling around it. And that's a little bit speculative, but I don't really believe that there was a world where Kenny Atkinson and his style and mentality was going to mesh well with a superstar-driven team, at least at that point in his career. And I think you saw that when the Nets went ahead with Steve Nash, who very much was then, well, here's full figurehead mode. This guy is not going to rub anyone's feathers the wrong way. He's going to let the stars do what they want to do. And then that proceeded to also be a disaster as well. So, reflectively, I think the Brooklyn Nets right now with where they are, listen, Jordi Fernandez, young coach, very excited about him, but there's a world where riding the Kenny Atkinson wave up to, into, and through the superstar era could have been just as fruitful or productive from, again, a young talent and player development standpoint. So long story long, I don't think Kenny Atkinson had a real chance to maintain that, barring this team coming in, setting the world on fire. And don't forget, Kevin Durant is injured when he first comes and joins Brooklyn. So there's also a gap there. And that allows for a little bit, I think, of Kyrie Irving, different roster pieces, and some growing sentiment around what's going to work or not. Fan bases are impatient. I think superstar players can be impatient as well. And that could be spelled the disaster for an incumbent coach who's perceived to be young team, developing team, not championship team.
So there's a couple things from that I think are worth bringing up. And one, handling superstars is one of the most difficult things to do as a coach in the NBA. And no two superstars are the same. I always thought it was ironic that, Durant and Kyrie essentially referenced how great the culture was in Brooklyn as far as why they were attracted to that situation. And then it seemed like they promptly just burnt that culture to a crisp and destroyed it pretty quickly.
They were really attracted to the money too. I always think
I mean, the money didn't hurt.
In here. I find that the best players in the world also like the places that provide them the most amount of money, as they well should, by the way. But that's always the funny thing, right? About culture and attractiveness of a franchise. You go, yeah, also we were free agents, slow facilitation with a little trade action, obviously, with the Golden State Warriors. But it's like, yeah, because you could give us the big contracts, as we well deserve.
Yes, that's also part of it. Also, I don't think Donovan Mitchell's going to say something along the lines of, well, some days Kenny's going to coach the team. Some days, I'll be the coach. Some days Evan will be the coach. That's not going to come out of his mouth. He's not wired that way. I certainly feel like I know him well enough to say that. So I do think that those things are worth bringing up, but I also wonder how much being around superstars in Golden State, particularly Steph Curry, and the way that things run there have rubbed off on Kenny over the last couple of years. Like, that is something that I'm very interested to see how he handles stars differently now compared to 2019.
Yeah, again, and success breeds that, right? Golden State, the success there allows Steve Kerr to set the tempo of that team. But to your point about Steph Curry also seems like a guy that you can be pretty bought into. Again, team success matters, but it didn't look like he was ever going to be someone that was going to raise a real red flag for you as far as butting heads with a coach. Likewise, the hierarchy there, okay, it's Steph, it's Clay, it's Draymond, and they all kind of fit into their roles, and they're a group together, and maybe finally that's starting to come apart here as they get a little bit older, and there's some big money and free agency for Clay. But I do think the carryover from that to Cleveland, and with Mitchell specifically, remember, if you take him at his word, as I'm sure you've covered, Mitchell said, it's about winning. Like, that's what he's about now, and he hasn't been able to do that yet. He hasn't been able to do it at the highest level. So if you get the coach that comes in and says, I've been in Golden State. I've built it from the ground up in Brooklyn. I've gotten some great experience with Steve Kerr and Golden State. I'm here to apply all of that. And it is about what you say you want, Donovan, winning basketball games. And I need you to be that centerpiece of it. I need you to represent that and have the buy-in around it. So that's where I think that this coach and superstar marriage is kind of, happening at the right time for both sides of it.
Yeah, I absolutely think that this is a very, very good fit. I really do. I wonder, too, as this offseason really starts to arrive, if the Cavs and Nets could be a good fit in terms of trade partners. We dive into that next right here on Locked On Cavs. Today's show is also brought to you by FanDuel. I love sports. You love sports if you're watching or listening to the show. Adam loves sports as well. There's no doubt about that. Playoffs are winding down. You're not getting quite as many sports on your television on a nightly basis as there's no more NBA. There's no more NHL. You do have WNBA. You do have Major League Baseball. One of the things that right now really, and I've talked about this all week, but the Cleveland Guardians are hot right now. They have, as we are recording this, they haven't played their game on Tuesday against Baltimore yet, but as we are recording this, they've got the second best record in all of Major League Baseball. But their odds to win the World Series are still pretty long at plus 2,200. That might be the bet. If you're a Guardians fan like I am, that might be the bet that you want to just attach a little bit of incentive to your rooting interest as October grows closer and the playoffs in Major League Baseball start up, because I think the Guardians are going to be part of it. I really like them at those odds. They're like 5th or 6th even in the American League in terms of best odds to win the World Series, which I think is outrageous, and I think you should take advantage of that on FanDuel, because this summer FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. Something for everyone, every day, all summer long. Head on over FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/LOCKEDON and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. So, Adam, I think that these two franchises are two organizations that have been talked about a lot for various reasons in terms of what the trade market could shape up to be. And I'm now at the point where I don't think either franchise has the player that is going to be the linchpin of the offseason. I've shifted. I thought originally it was going to be Donovan Mitchell and his decision, but I think there's been some clarity there. And I just think that the Cavs feel very, very confident for good reason he's going to sign an extension. I actually think Paul George in LA is now the guy that sort of the NBA is going to be waiting on. But another name that pops up, and I'm sure you know where I'm going with this, is Mikal Bridges in Brooklyn. What direction do the Nets want to go with him?
Oh, we could talk about this for hours, Danny. That's the $1 million question. I mean, listen, from an outward perspective, everything Brooklyn has communicated is we're not interested in trading Mikal Bridges. You've heard the teams are calling them. They may be picking up the phone, but you're not hearing anything about the Nets shopping Mikal Bridges. Ultimately, with the Ben Simmons contract coming off the books after this season, they're going to have a lot of money. They have some young players that they really like. Noah Clowney starts to showcase himself at the end of last year, maybe coming on even sooner in his young career than expected. Claxton, if they're going to bring him back, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea is, well, we keep this together for one more year, and then we go get star X, Y, or Z. That being said, the Donovan Mitchell situation is a prime example of when you hear this player is going to be available. So you say, oh, well, if we can go get Donovan Mitchell with Mikal Bridges and Cameron Johnson, now we got a team we can get pretty excited about. Oh, sorry, he's going to sign an extension. More likely he's going to stay in Cleveland because guess what? The Cavs aren't fools. They don't want to give up a superstar talent and fall into the somewhat irrelevant abyss that the Nets sit in right now. So as we lead towards the draft and coming out of the draft even, I think there's at least this sentiment that there are enough teams calling about Mikal Bridges that maybe that, quote unquote, Godfather offer is out there that the Nets find it hard to refuse. The only issue here, I think, from a Cleveland perspective would be, I don't think that there's enough there in Cleveland, especially from a draft capital standpoint, that the Nets would look at them as being the ideal trade partner to be able to move Mikal Bridges and then still look at the future and say, we've increased our chances to improve over the next couple of seasons.
Yeah, I really do agree with that. For as perfect as I think Bridges would be in Cleveland alongside Donovan Mitchell and Evan Mobley, like I think he'd be a perfect fit. I'm not sure what type of interest the Nets would have on a Darius Garland-led package because I think if they trade Bridges, it's signaling, okay, we know we don't have our picks, but this is going to be painful, but we have to go through a true rebuild and not try and microwave something the way that, they have in the past with trades for superstars. And the point about superstars becoming available via free agency, it just doesn't seem like it happens as often as it used to where now guys become available via trade. But I do think players have gotten smarter to the point where they're now just, when a team offers an extension, take it. And if you don't like that situation, you can figure it out 2 years from now. Take it, stick it out for a year or two. But we've seen guys now. I mean, we're talking about maybe Darius Garland wanting out of Cleveland with 4 years left on his deal. Like that is becoming commonplace in the NBA. So I do wonder what the best path forward is. I also wonder if these two teams were to make a trade. I don't think it's one for Bridges. If it is one for Bridges, there absolutely would have to be a third team that gets involved somehow.
You need to expand this thing out to get the Nets the draft capital probably. So you mentioned it. We talked about before on our show, Doug and I, the Darius Garland centric one. Well, the age is right. The contract's long. I think that people are kind of undervaluing him a little bit right now relative to 2 seasons ago when he was, an ascending talent in the league. So they could look at that as being viable. You could also look at it as, well, where can Darius Garland go? And then those picks end up coming over to Brooklyn in a potential trade for Mikal Bridges. Again, the other side of it is, I don't know if you would identify a young talent on Cleveland that would be very attractive in terms of rebuilding a new core for Brooklyn. But there could be enough there. I mean, certainly, once you bring a third team in, all bets are off. And then the other side of that, I'll say quickly, is that whether it's a third team that gets a Mikal Bridges deal done or that any team comes calling about Mikal Bridges, well, then all of a sudden the roster as a whole becomes open. Cameron Johnson becomes viable. Dorian Finney-Smith becomes viable. We're hearing right now, even a young player like Day'Ron Sharpe, that some teams are starting to get some buzz around because he's in a pivotal year in terms of extension eligibility. Well, there's form and function here to rebuild a roster a little bit, and maybe that's actually an area where Cleveland can play a little. I wonder from your perspective, I'm sure your fans have heard, But what do they think they need to do here in the short term to stay high level competitive, to be back in the top 4 seeding next season? When you hear rumblings about Garland or rumblings about Jared Allen, it seems like they're right on the precipice of saying, we believe in Donovan Mitchell, we want to build around him, and we also may need to kind of violently reconstruct this team in order to be successful going forward.
I think that there are a lot of fans that would be content with running back the core four, as it's called here in Cleveland, of, Mitchell, Garland, Mobley, and Allen. I don't think that's the best path forward because they don't have enough on the wing. And you see that, you need someone to win at the highest level. You need someone that is really good and about 6'8". And the Cavs don't have a guy like that right now. They've got guys that are really good that are 7 feet tall. They've got guys that are really good that are 6'2", 6'3". They don't have anyone in the middle of that. And that's what they need to find. So I do think that the best path forward is probably reallocating some of their talent, mainly Darius Garland, maybe Jared Allen as well. To a great wing player. Now, that said, that is much easier to say out loud in theory than it is to actually execute. Like, that's a tough trade to pull off, which is why we've spent a lot of the offseason searching. There's certainly a section of the fan base that believes that's what should be done. There's a section of the fan base that just says, hey, run it back. This is a really good team. Continuity is rare in the NBA, but when you have it, it's often very good. I think when this team is healthy, given that they play a different style of basketball than a lot of teams in the league, they can be a tough team to prepare for, just like on a Tuesday night in December. They can win a lot of games. I think they have a pretty high floor. Like, if they're all healthy, they should win 50-plus games. They should be a top 4 team in the East. I just don't know that this team as constructed right now is built to have playoff success because they cannot generate enough offense when push comes to shove in the postseason. I think that's the biggest issue.
Yeah, I mean, listen, high success rate, right? Donovan Mitchell's entering the prime of his career. The window is now for a team like Cleveland. So it makes it fascinating to see what they do. And from a Nets perspective, again, it's just about you'd like to see being active around the draft, weak draft class. You'd like to be active around fielding these calls. But the landscape changes very quickly. You're now hearing that Fox isn't going to sign the extension with the Kings because he wants to see what they're going to do. Well, boom. Now all of a sudden he's on Cleveland's radar maybe, or on Brooklyn's radar next year, right? So the NBA changes very quickly. The narratives change very quickly. And sometimes waiting, whether it's 3 months, 6 months, or a full season, all of a sudden you turn around and go, oh, I didn't realize that player X, Y, or Z was going to be available. And you can look at things a little bit differently. A little more pressure in Cleveland right now, obviously.
Yeah, certainly. Adam, thank you so much for doing this. Very much appreciate the insights into the Kenny Atkinson era in Brooklyn.
You better believe it anytime.
Find Adam's podcast, Locked On Nets, the same place you find this podcast, Locked On Cavs. Thank you for making Locked On Cavs your first listen every day. Make Locked On Nets your second listen every day. You can subscribe to the YouTube channel. Make sure you like this video if you haven't already. We will be back. Draft stuff. I will not be going live tonight. Unfortunately, I will be at the Cavs facility to speak with some folks there after they make their selection or trade away their selection at number 20. But I will have content going up after the draft on Wednesday nights. So stay tuned for that. We'll be back Thursday as well. A loaded rest of the week, but thank you for making Locked On Cavs your first listen every day. Have a great day, everybody.